for more than a quarter of a century, I have been focusing on the possibility of a forgotten episode in human history, of a lost civilization. And undoubtedly, my best-known book in that field is Fingerprints of the Gods, that was published in 1995. It helped me to understand that in dealing with history, and particularly in dealing with prehistory, there is a difference, because history is based primarily upon written documents. And prehistory, you're dealing with objects, artifacts that are dug up out of the ground. I began to realize how ideological this is, that actually when I'm dealing with academics, with archaeologists or professional skeptics of any kind, I'm dealing with people who already have an ideological position. And that ideological position is confronted by the position I take. So in an ideological war, what you try to do is to destroy your opponent in any way, fair or foul. And it's helped me to understand that there is an ideological war over our past. A classic example that I go into in this new book of archaeology going radically, drastically wrong. And it's partly connected to that so-called overkill theory, where the megafauna were supposedly wiped out by this ruthless hunter-gatherer population. And it's an archaeological theory called Clovis first. And it dominated American archaeology for 50 years. The notion, there's a culture that archaeologists call the Clovis culture. We don't know what they call themselves. They're called the Clovis culture because what's called the type site, the classic site that they were at, is near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, in a place called Blackwater Draw, near Clovis, New Mexico. And apparently the archaeologists needed to go to Clovis to get beer, so they called it the Clovis culture. And this Clovis culture, there's no evidence of it in North America before 13,600 years ago. It flourishes for about 800 years, and 12,800 years ago, it vanishes completely from the picture. The position of archaeology for 50 years is those were the first human beings to enter America. No human beings entered the Americas before 13,600 years ago. And those are the same archaeologists who repeatedly called me a pseudoscientist or a pseudo-archaeologist for suggesting other possibilities. But lo and behold, what do we find? Round about 2010 onwards, the evidence becomes overwhelming that Clovis was not first at all, not first by a huge margin. As part of the research for this book, I went to the San Diego Natural History Museum and interviewed Dr. Tom Desmarais, who's the chief paleontologist there. The reason I interviewed him was because he'd just had an extraordinary paper published in Nature in April 2017. And that paper documents human presence in North America 130,000 years ago. That's 10 times as old as the Clovis culture. All archaeologists admit this now, that the Clovis first was a mistake. They got it wrong, completely wrong. Human beings have been in America for much longer than that. But what they don't comment upon is the careers that were ruined as a result. People like Jacques Saint-Mars, who excavated Bluefish Caves in the Yukon. He had his career literally ripped to shreds by his colleagues because he was proposing humans in America 25,000 years ago. He had his research funding withdrawn. He could only continue on his own buck. Nobody was supporting him, but he was right. He was right, and this happens again and again. So when archaeologists of that type say, Hancock is a pseudoscientist, I say, hang on a minute, you guys are the pseudoscientists. You guys sold us Clovis first for 50 years. You guys withdrew funding from research that might have exposed that lie earlier. You wouldn't let it happen. And that's not right. It shouldn't be that way. Archaeologists should not take the view that they have got a firm and fixed picture of the past, because actually we know so little about the past. They should always be saying this is our provisional position, but we are open to other possibilities. Because if they don't say that, those other possibilities are going to come along and kick them in the ass pretty soon. And that's what's happened with Clovis first. And Clovis first is not a small matter, because if human beings have been in the Americas for 130,000 years instead of for 13,000 years, why, there's 100,000 plus years that archaeologists just haven't looked at because of their preconceived notion that there was going to be nothing to find. There was actually a dictum against digging below Clovis levels. You know how in archaeological strata it's like a layer cake,
right,
and you have certain levels. And the view was, let's not waste research funds digging below Clovis because we know there was nothing before Clovis. What an idiotic, what a ridiculous position to take. Those archaeologists who did risk it and who dug deeper, like Al Goodyear at Topper in the Carolinas, they found human stuff going back tens of thousands of years earlier. So, you know, I think we're dealing with an ideological discipline, and I think it should be more provisional in what it says and in what it claims, and it should be less despising of people who consider other possibilities, because that's a useful thing to do. It's useful to consider other possibilities, even if they're wrong. Science should never get locked in a narrow channel and say everything outside the bounds of this channel is not subject to investigation. It's really a mistake.